Hey, Richard, nice to see you again. How are things?
Hey, good morning. Good morning, Steve. It's good to see you. Thank you so much for chatting with me. I'm really excited for our conversation.
Of course, no, it was great to have you on the call yesterday as well. You definitely contributed a lot to the group, so I was glad to have you there.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you. That's very kind of you. Yeah, I like that you've kind of brought people together. It looks like a very supportive community. So it's definitely something that folks should take advantage of.
Yeah, it's cool. I mean, the students create the community, so I just provide the space, but it's fun to play there. So
Yeah.
I know we talked a bit yesterday, but
Mhm.
how's everything sinking in for you since then?
Yeah. I got to say, it was good to get some advice from folks yesterday. I think that one thing that I want to take is being deliberate about my review process, not just doing it ad hoc, but actually being more targeted. I think I could be a bit more targeted, and also giving myself room to just take breaks. I think that that's important. I'm close to my goal, at least if my practice tests are a reliable indicator. But I've still got plenty of runway between now and October. And so I want to make sure that I'm being deliberate about how I study.
Sure. Okay, so we've talked about review. I assume you may be familiar with the Socratic review method I've laid out. And so I guess the question, is that the case? Are you familiar with it?
Uh, I mean, somewhat. I think, asking questions, figuring out, why, if I was down to two answers, what was attractive about the wrong answer, what was discouraging about the right answer, things like that.
Okay, yeah. So you got the general theme underlying
Yeah.
the general principle there. So what would you say is your biggest challenge that I could support you on?
So I have actually three main questions, but they're basically just what separates a 160 scorer, which is what I'm getting, from a 170 scorer in each of the three main, sections. And so I have more specific concerns I have for each of the sections. But in general, that's that's the question I would like your help answering for all three sections.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. So first thing that comes to mind is not simply blindly applying the strategies, but understanding why the strategies work. That's overarching across all sections.
Okay. And I'm typing, by the way. So
Yeah, sure. With regard to games, it comes down to a couple things. One is efficiency. And efficiency comes down to reusing previous hypothetical scenarios and making more inferences up front. Someone who's getting a 170 is typically getting perfect on games, maybe -1, but games are the most perfectible. And so there's not really room to sacrifice points there. And obviously there are exceptions, but generally top scorers are getting perfect on games. Again, maybe -1. The other thing is being ready for curveballs. And so that means not simply blindly applying strategies, but rather being adaptive and being flexible so that even if a new unfamiliar game appears, you'll be able to handle it.
okay.
Logical reasoning, again, Socratic review method. So leaving no stone unturned in terms of where your misunderstanding may have stemmed from. It could be the stimulus, the stem, or the choices. You talked about the choices already, but I will also encourage you to think about the method of reasoning in the stimulus and being, again, flexible with that method of reasoning such that it's not just about question type. You could drill questions by type. People often do. So flaw versus necessary assumption and such. But I would be looking for you to see how a test maker could take a given method of reasoning and convert it into a wide variety of question stem types. So flaw and necessary assumption being two sides of the same coin. Necessary assumption, what assumption is required in order for the argument to work? And then for a flaw question, we would say, okay, well, that underlying assumption, what if we accuse them of taking that for granted or failing to consider that may not occur?
Okay,
So
that's good.
Yeah, so thinking about how they go about even constructing these questions in the first place, where you could imagine mixing and matching stimulus and stem.
Okay.
And then that
Yeah.
would simply require a slight reframing of the answer choice.
Yeah. Because I was thinking that, people kind of talk a lot about the question, and I'm like, well, Actually, I care more about what's in the stimulus, because if I understand the stimulus fully, it doesn't really matter what the question is. So I think that just being able to have a handle on that, and you talk about method of reasoning, I guess my next question would be, how do you break down the method of reasoning? Is that like the diagramming? Is that how you do it, or is there something else involved?
It's not really about diagramming to me. It's logical reasoning. Most questions types don't really benefit from diagramming because most of it's informal logic or inductive reasoning rather than deductive, where you have formulas and conditionals.
Okay. So if I'm reading the stimulus, when I think of their method of reasoning, that's just more in general, what are their premises? What role do those premises play in supporting the conclusion? Things like that?
Yeah, so how do they go about making their argument? What are the underlying principles? And how is it possible for the evidence to be true, yet for the conclusion to not necessarily follow? So how can you problematize it?
Okay.
So when you're dealing with causal claims, it raises questions. Well, what about alternative possibilities? What about alternative explanations? How can we know that the supposed cause is in fact the cause or the only potential cause? So I'm looking for real world engagement there. And that's not something diagramming can help you with. I find that students often over rely on diagramming as if it's going to unlock the answer, when in reality, you're simply converting every subject into a capital letter, but it may not really be getting you anywhere. And so that diagramming approach, I think, is more along the lines of a rote and simply blindly applying something you heard from somebody else without really thinking about, is this truly serving you?
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah, that's pretty big.
So how many, when you approach logical reasoning, how many questions or what percentage would you say that you're diagramming?
Oh, that's a good question. Whenever I only diagram the ones that have like statements where there's some or all. So for some teachers, or no, all. There was one on a recent practice I took where it said like some teachers use a certain kitchen, food is made in that kitchen, therefore we can conclude that the teachers are preparing the food. Which answer choice would make that logically valid? And so that one I would be tempted to diagram, because, okay, I know that some teachers use it, not all teachers use it, but all food is cooked, that whole thing. That's how I would diagram. But it sounds like you're saying that might not be, so you asked the percentage. So I'd say maybe a proportion of those kinds of questions, maybe 10%. I'm definitely not doing it for the vast majority, but for those, that would be my default. And then also parallel reasoning, where I mentioned this yesterday on the call, but I feel just I have a crutch on parallel reasoning, because once I see those big paragraphs, I just get really intimidated, because each answer choice, and I'm nervous about wasting time, and I get in my own head. So, yeah.
I hear you. Well, 10% is not bad. We're talking 2-3 questions a section that you're diagramming.
I'd say 4 to 5.
Okay, 4 to 5. Okay.
Yeah, that'd be more.
That could still be okay depending on exactly which question types they were. I mean, parallels are one of the types that I might sometimes diagram. A lot of folks do like to diagram the sum, most, all kinds of questions, which I wouldn't always do. I like to diagram only all statements, because some and most are not true conditionals. And so they require a little bit of recognition that it's a soft conditional or not a true conditional. But that's beside the point here. I think overall the idea is that you're not diagramming most of them, which is really good to hear.
No, definitely not most. I would even argue that I've gotten to the point where I'm not relying on intuition. Like I've practiced the basics, but I'm good enough at spotting what wrong answers look like that I can kind of answer fairly quickly. It's just when I start to get to like those later, tougher questions, I slow down a bit. Also on that, would you recommend would you always recommend going with the easier questions first, like for logical reasoning, the earlier questions? But would it not make sense to do the harder ones first?
I would do the easier ones first.
Okay.
Everything's worth the same. There's no benefit to spending more time on tougher questions if you haven't already gotten the easy ones done and secured in the bag.
I was just wondering. Cool. And then for reading comp, what separates the 160 score from the 170s?
Structure over details.
Okay. Structure over detail. So that would be main point, the tone, like premises and evidence, conclusion, what would you say is the most efficient way to read the passage to get a sense of the structure?
Looking for the author's opinion and focusing on that.
Okay.
You're not really reading for the information. You're not really reading for the content. Of course, it's important to know where the details are so you can go back and find them when you need to. But as you said, there is a certain category of questions where you can knock those out just having a good sense of the main idea and why the author wrote this. And so as the global ones, main idea, primary purpose, passage organization, tone, and title, I would knock out those questions first because those are the easiest ones and because you can knock them out simply knowing the author's opinion.
Okay. Yeah, I've tried to practice that a bit where I give myself like limited time to read the passage, but then I'll try to attack questions in the most efficient order. So I'll go after like the specific word questions, tone, usually anything that isn't about the big picture. But that's more in terms of speed. But no, that makes sense. I actually have another question that's more so based on the digital platform. Obviously, when we're taking the exam on the page, we can kind of scan the different questions versus on the digital, you'd have to click through, particularly for reading comp where, at least for me, the questions are all separate. Would you still recommend it, even though you have to click through different questions to try and find which ones might be easier to answer first?
Yeah, it's definitely a bit more annoying. So I would just say, try it and see if it works for you.
Okay.
It's, clicking left and right takes another second or so, but I can understand that you're lacking that bird's eye view could be frustrating.
Okay, cool.
But play with it. And you're right that you can only see one question at a time, both on the digital and on the Flex. Right.
I think that other than that, yesterday I asked about study plans. I got some good advice there, but I know you said be deliberate about what I choose to review. And I got advised to review quickly after taking exams, like not waiting too long. So I still remember my thought process. I guess if there's anything besides that, what I just mentioned, that you would advise someone who's trying to get to the 170s by October, anything else you would recommend?
I think between today and yesterday, you've got a lot to think about, a lot of food for thought, a lot to work on. And I would encourage you again, regarding reading comp, that last piece we were talking about is to keep in mind what we discussed yesterday in the group coaching call around trying out different approaches and experimenting. You have 2 months, so you have plenty of time to play and see what you like and what you don't like.
Okay, cool. This is very helpful. Okay, yeah, this is very helpful. Could I ask about rec letters really quick?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so I have a recommendation letter that my recommender asked that I draft. She is a non-academic recommender, but I really value her perspective. And I was wondering, what are some really quick things to make sure that you are mentioning especially since I have to draft it, I'm not an expert on this stuff, but what are things I should mention and what should I avoid? Or what for a draft, like what should be, what's appropriate and what should I stay away from?
Yeah, well, I think the red flag is damning with faint praise. So be specific and make relative comparisons. So specifics would be details about, details or anecdotes about their time with you and what they've observed, what you've done. And then relative comparisons. So if you stood out in some way, in the work environment or in the classroom environment, whatever it was. In this case, obviously work environment or extracurricular, I would imagine in some way.
Okay, cool.
So if you took initiative in a certain area,
okay,
that helps you stand apart.
Do they care more about if you would be a good student or if you would be a good lawyer?
That's a good question. Wow. I would think about showing that you have what it takes to succeed in law school. And that also relates to what shows how you would succeed in professional environments. So it's about, I think persistence is a big thing.
Okay.
Ability to overcome obstacles.
Okay.
A lot of this carries across both.
Okay. Perfect. All right. I know we've got our 15-minute time, but this has been very helpful, Steve. I'm really grateful, and I'll be sure to peruse through your channel and the Facebook group to see if there's anything else. But this is really useful. So thank you so much.
Fantastic. No, I'm glad to help. But before we sign off, what would you say is the biggest insight you got from our call, either today or yesterday or both?
Sure. I think that I need to be more intentional about trying out different strategies. I think that if I want to progress, I have to be, I can't just rely on rote, like, okay, this is what I'm supposed to do for these. Like I have to be able to think flexibly. I think that that's something that really stood out to me, particularly for the method of reasoning, both for logical reasoning and for reading comprehension. I think if I can figure out how to identify the method of reasoning without relying on a diagram, I think that'll help me get over the edge for my intended score. So that's something that I'll carry with me.
Fantastic. Well, keep at it and let me know if you need anything moving forward.
Yeah. Thank you, Steve. I appreciate it, man. You're the man. Subscribe to his YouTube channel, please. If you're looking to go to law school, this guy knows what he's doing.
Thanks, Richard. I appreciate it. All the best and keep in touch.